The scream that tore through the deadly silence of the Theban palace was not a scream of physical pain. It was the sound of a shattered soul, a universe collapsing at its core. Inside the royal bedchamber, where the scent of incense and power still lingered, there was now only the smell of tragedy. Queen Jocasta, the woman who had once been the pride of an entire kingdom, hung suspended in the air, her precious silk shawl a noose that tightened around her past and her future. Her death was not a loud one. It was a silent finality, a total surrender to a truth more terrible than death. But the scream was not hers. It came from the king, the hero, Oedipus. There he stood, no longer the savior of Thebes, no longer the wise sphinx solver. He was simply a man staring into his own abyss. His gaze was fixed on the motionless form of Jocasta, the one he called his wife, the one fate had revealed to be mother. A madness, not of disease, but of truth, surged through him. He rushed forward, plucking the glittering golden brooches from her garments. Gold, power, glory, all were now inanimate objects, silent witnesses to his heinous crime. And then, in an act of the most barbaric self-punishment, Oedipus raised the two pins high, and with all the force of his disgust, he drove them straight into his own eyes. Blood did not flow from a sword wound. It oozed from the very sockets of his eyes, where the light once reigned, where he once proudly gazed upon his kingdom, upon his wife and children, upon himself in admiration. Now he extinguished that light with his own hands, choosing eternal darkness rather than face the truth that his eyes had seen. He cried out that these eyes would never again see the suffering he had caused and the suffering he had endured. He wanted to be blind, so that he would no longer see the faces of his children, the products of his incestuous marriage, who were both his sons and his brothers. To understand this horrific act of self-destruction, to explain why a wise king would plunge himself into darkness, we must turn back the clock of fate. Only hours earlier, Oedipus had been a powerful king, desperately searching for the truth to save Thebes from the great plague that was ravaging it. An oracle from Delphi had said that the plague would end only when the murderer of his predecessor, Laius, was found and banished. With the confidence of a wise man, Oedipus vowed to find the murderer, cursing him to a miserable life of ostracism. Little did he know, the curse was already upon himself. His investigation led him to two final witnesses, a messenger from Corinth and an old shepherd who had served in Laius's court. The messenger reported that King Polybus of Corinth, whom Oedipus believed to be his father, had died of old age. Oedipus breathed a sigh of relief, believing that he had escaped the prophecy that he would kill his father. But then, the same messenger, with the good intention of reassuring Oedipus completely, planted the seed of the terrible truth. Polybus is not your real father. I myself received you, a baby with your legs pierced, from the hands of a shepherd of King Laius on Mount Cithaeron. All eyes turned to the old, trembling shepherd. Queen Jocasta, her face drained of color, took in the terrible picture. She begged Oedipus, for the god's sake, if you value your life, stop this investigation. But Oedipus, in his blind pride in his pursuit of truth, brushed her off. He thought she was afraid he would discover her humble origins. Jocasta gave him one last desperate look and rushed into the palace. She knew it was all over. Left alone, Oedipus forced the shepherd to speak. And then, word by word, the truth was revealed like a torn wound. The child was the son of King Laius and Queen Jocasta. They had given him to be discarded because of a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. In that moment, Oedipus, the great riddle solver, finally solved the riddle of his own life. The man he killed at the fork of the road to Thebes was Laius, his father. The woman he married, who bore him 4 children, was Jocasta, his mother. The curse was fulfilled. The heart-rending scream we heard at the beginning was the scream of truth. The truth that Oedipus has just discovered in his own blood and tears is not a single event, but the convergence of 2 fateful paths laid out long before. To see how cruelly and perfectly the hand of the gods has orchestrated this tragedy, we must go back even further to the very path that brought Oedipus to the gates of Thebes. That path began with another prophecy he received at Delphi, that he would kill his father and marry his mother. To escape fate, he left Corinth, leaving King Polybus and Queen Merope, whom he believed to be his parents. But to flee fate, for the Greeks, was to run straight into its embrace. Imagine a deserted, dusty crossroads under the harsh Greek sun. Here, three roads meet, and three destinies collide in a seemingly meaningless encounter. A royal chariot approaches, carrying an elderly man with a noble yet arrogant appearance. It is Laius, king of Thebes, father of Oedipus, on his way to Delphi to seek the advice of the gods on how to free the city from the monster Sphinx. At the same time, a young, robust traveler also approaches the fork. It is Oedipus, the young man fleeing Corinth. The pride of two royal bloodlines, one old and one young, one who knows he is a king and one who does not know he is a prince, collide. Laius's charioteer shouts at the traveler to make way for the king. Oedipus, with the pride of a young man and the anger he had felt at the curse, refused. A word was exchanged, a push was made, and then Laius himself, in a fit of rage, lashed Oedipus with his horsewhip. The fire broke out. Oedipus did not know who the other man was. He only saw a nobleman who had insulted him. And in his rage, he struck back with his staff. A fatal blow. The king of Thebes fell and died at the hands of the son he had ordered to be abandoned long ago, right at an anonymous crossroads. The prophecy was half fulfilled, not in a battle for the throne, but in a trivial brawl over the way. The gods had shown that they did not need grand scenes to carry out their will. They only needed to sow pride and anger in the hearts of men. Oedipus stepped over his father's corpse, unsuspecting, and continued his journey. He reached the outskirts of Thebes, a city living in fear. Not only had they lost their king in a mysterious attack, but they had also been imprisoned by a monster, the Sphinx. It had the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the face of a woman. It perched on a cliff at the entrance to the city and posed a riddle to anyone who tried to pass. Those who failed to solve it were torn apart and eaten. Many heroes of Thebes died. The city was plunged into mourning and despair. The appearance of Oedipus, a stranger, did not bring much hope. But he, the man destined to solve riddles, bravely faced it. The Sphinx spoke in a mournful voice. What goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus, with his sharp intellect, saw through the implication. He answered without hesitation, that is man, crawling on all 4s as a child, walking on 2 legs as an adult, and using a stick as a 3rd leg in old age. The answer was perfect. The Sphinx, in defeat and disgrace, threw herself off a cliff. The city of Thebes was saved. Oedipus had gone from being an unknown traveler to a great savior. The people hailed him. Creon, Queen Jocasta's brother and acting regent, made good on his promise. Whoever solved the Sphinx's riddle would win the throne and marry the widowed queen. And so, as a reward for his wisdom, Oedipus ascended the throne of his homeland, Thebes. He sat on the throne of the father he had just murdered, and he married Queen Jocasta, the widow of that king, his mother. The tragedy was perfectly orchestrated. He killed his father on the way and married his mother as a reward for his feat the city of Thebes, in an effort to save itself from a monster, inadvertently brought upon itself an even more terrible curse, placing it right at the heart of power in the very royal bed. And so the throne of Thebes was taken, and the queen's bed was taken. A new king, a hero, a husband. But why such a terrible curse? Why would the gods weave such a complex and cruel web of fate to ensnare one man? The answer does not lie with Oedipus. He, in his tragedy, was both sinner and victim, but above all he was the instrument of a greater punishment. The roots of this cursed empire lay deeper in the past, in a forgotten sin, a violation of the most sacred laws. Its roots lay with Laius himself, his dead father. Before becoming king of Thebes, Laius spent his youth in exile in the kingdom of Pisa as a guest of King Pelops. There, instead of respecting the sacred laws of hospitality, Laius committed an unforgivable crime. He abused his host's trust, abducted and raped Chrysippus, King Pelops' beloved son. This act was not just a crime of lust, it was a sacrilege. In his rage and grief, King Pelops cursed Laius and his entire lineage. The curse said that if Laius had a son, he would die by that son's hand. The curse was born of a sin, a stain on the honor of an entire family, and the gods listened. Years later, Laius returned to reclaim the throne of Thebes and marry Jocasta, the daughter of one of the noblest houses. They ruled in glory, but had no children. Their desire for an heir drove them to the temple of Delphi, the holiest of places, to seek guidance from Apollo. But instead of a blessing, they received a confirmation of the old curse, now with a more gruesome twist. Apollo's priestess, in a trance, pronounced, "King of Thebes, the son you bear will kill his own father and marry his mother." The curse was no longer a remote possibility. It was a certain fate guaranteed by the gods themselves. The joy of having a child was immediately replaced by utter horror. When Jocasta gave birth to a healthy baby boy, fear gripped their mother and father. They saw the child not as a gift, but as a death sentence. And they did what desperate men do when faced with the will of the gods. They decided to fight against it. Laius, in a desperate attempt to change the future, took iron pins and drove them through the ankles of his newborn son, both to mark him and to prevent him from crawling away. He then entrusted the child to a faithful servant, the same old shepherd whom Oedipus would encounter years later, and ordered him to be carried to the desolate peaks of Mount Cithaeron to be left to the elements. They believed that by destroying the child, they would destroy the prophecy. They were wrong. Laius and Jocasta's cruel actions, motivated by fear, were the first and most important step toward the fulfillment of the prophecy. Human compassion overcame the king's command. The shepherd could not bear to abandon an innocent life. He gave the baby to another shepherd from Corinth, who brought him to King Polybus and Queen Merope, the barren royal couple. They adopted the child, naming him Oedipus, swollen foot, after the injury to his ankle. They loved and raised him as their own, keeping his origins a secret. By attempting to kill his son, Laius ensured that the child would grow up without ever knowing his father. By pushing him away, he created a stranger whom he would one day meet at a crossroads. The curse was sown not by the gods, but by men's own efforts to resist it. The circle of fate was closed. The tragedy of Oedipus, the fall of Jocasta, and the blood-soaked darkness that fell over Thebes all stemmed from the sin of a king and the despair of a father who tried to escape his own shadow. The darkness that Oedipus chose for himself was not just the darkness of his eyes. It was a veil that hung over all of Thebes. The plague may have receded when the culprit was exposed, but another, deeper and more virulent plague, the plague of guilt and truth, had seeped into the very stones of the palace, into the very blood of his successors. Oedipus, once a righteous king, had become a living symbol of impurity, a cursed man whom no one dared approach. The curse that he had so angrily cast upon Laius's murderer, that he should be banished to live in disgrace, now fell upon him in perfect harmony. Creon, his brother-in-law, now regent, had carried out that banishment. Thebes, the city that Oedipus had saved and ruled, now shunned him like a disease. But in the darkness of abandonment, a filial light shone. Antigone, one of his two daughters, did not turn her back on her sinful father. Despite the horrifying truth that her father was also her brother, she chose the path of love over disgust. She volunteered to be eyes for her blind father, a walking stick for her crippled father. The two, a fallen king and a loyal princess, began their bitter journey of exile, wandering around Greece, living at the mercy of men. The image was a haunting contrast, the cruel punishment of the gods and the undying loyalty of men. Meanwhile, in Thebes, the legacy of the curse continues to rot from within. Eteocles and Polynices, Oedipus' two sons, have now grown up to compete for their father's blood-stained throne. The incestuous curse runs through their veins, turning brotherly love into jealousy and ambition. They come to an agreement. They will both rule 1 year at a time in rotation. But power, once tasted, can be toxic. Eteocles, after enjoying a year on the throne, refuses to hand over power to Polynices as agreed. Betrayed and banished by his own brother, Polynices is consumed with hatred. He travels to the kingdom of Argos, marries the king's daughter, and uses his influence to rally a mighty army, the army of the Seven, to fight against Thebes. The family tragedy now became a national tragedy. Polynices led a foreign army to attack his own homeland against his brother, who was holed up inside. Fratricidal war broke out. Thebes was once again engulfed in bloodshed, but this time not by an outsider monster, but by the city's own children. The Theban soldiers fought against the exiled Theban brothers who had sided with Polynices. Every victory was a loss, every death a wound to the kingdom's body. The curse now took the form of swords and battle, divine punishment meted out by human hands. The siege dragged on, culminating in the two brothers, Eteocles and Polynices, deciding to settle their differences in a duel. They faced each other outside the city gates, not as princes, but as two cornered beasts, driven by hatred that had been nurtured in their blood. They fought savagely, and in the end, they fulfilled the only wish they could share. They both fell, stabbing each other with their swords. The two brothers died on the same ground, ending the fight with their own lives. The curse of Laius was once again fulfilled in its entirety. Creon, now the only legitimate king, issued a new decree. Eteocles, who had died defending the city, would be buried with all the honors due a hero. Polynices, who had led a foreign army to ravage his homeland, would be branded a traitor. His body would be left unburied, unmourned, to be eaten by birds and wild beasts. This decree, meant to restore order, was the seed of a new tragedy. It violated the sacred law of the gods, which demanded that all dead be buried. And it presented Antigone with a terrible choice: obey the law of the king, or obey the law of the heart and the gods. The punishment of Thebes was not yet over. It was only mutating, waiting to devour its next victim. The silence that fell on the battlefield of Thebes after the deaths of the brothers Eteocles and Polynices was not the silence of peace, but the silence of an awaiting grave. King Creon's decree, honoring one and vilifying the other, had drawn a line not only on earth, but also between human law and divine will. Inside the palace, the last two daughters of the Oedipus line, Antigone and Ismene, faced the final legacy of their family, an impossible choice. Ismene, trembling with fear, saw only the power of the king and the certainty of death. She begged her sister to accept the reality that they were weak women, unable to resist the will of an entire nation. But Antigone did not see a king. She saw only a mortal arrogantly challenging the eternal law. In her veins ran not only the curse, but also her father's pride and courage. For her, leaving her brother to be torn apart by wild beasts was a sin worse than death. Under cover of darkness, Antigone sneaks out of the city gates alone. She finds the body of Polynices. She cannot give him a proper burial, but she does what her conscience and the gods demand. A handful of dust is sprinkled on the body. A few drops of wine are poured as an offering. It is a small act, a silent defiance, but it is enough to seal her fate. The guards capture her and bring her before Creon. The confrontation is not between king and sinner, but between two worldviews. Creon, with the anger of a challenged ruler, questions her. Antigone does not deny her guilt. She holds her head high, declaring that Creon's laws are only human laws, changeable and forgotten. But the divine law, which demands respect for the dead, is immutable and eternal. She would rather die to obey that law than live in the shame of having obeyed an unjust decree. Antigone's determination, in Creon's eyes, was unforgivable stubbornness. His pride as a king would not allow him to back down. Even when his son, Haman, who was betrothed to Antigone, knelt down and begged for mercy, Creon did not change his mind. He considered mercy a weakness. He ordered that Antigone not be killed by sword or spear, but that she be taken to a cave, sealed, and left to rot. A cruel punishment, both to avoid direct royal bloodshed and to prolong his punishment. But as Creon was settling his score, the blind prophet Tiresias appeared again, as he had appeared to Oedipus. He warned Creon that the gods were angry. The heavens no longer heard the prayers of Thebes. The offerings on the altars were defiled. The gods were angry that a dead man was left unburied, and a living man was buried. Tiresias prophesied that Creon would pay for his stubbornness with his own blood, a corpse for a corpse. Tiresias' prophecy finally terrified Creon. He quickly changed his mind, personally led the men to bury Polynices, and then ran to the cave to free Antigone. But it was too late. Fate's hand is always one step ahead of human repentance. When they broke down the cave, the scene inside was one of terrible silence. Antigone used her own shawl to hang herself, a death so haunting that it recalled the image of her mother, Jocasta. Creon's son Haman was holding his lover's body. Seeing his father, in a frenzy of pain, he drew his sword to attack Creon, but missed. And then, without a word, Haman stabbed himself in the side and died beside Antigone. Tragedy followed tragedy. When news of Haman's death reached the palace, Queen Eurydice, Creon's wife, could not bear the pain. She quietly went inside and used a dagger to end her own life, still cursing her husband who had caused it all. Creon returns to the palace, his son's body in his arms, only to be confronted by the body of his wife. In one day, he has lost everything: his family, his honor, his sanity. He is no longer the king of Thebes. He is only an empty shell, a man consumed by grief. The curse on the house of Laius is finally complete. The lineage is extinguished. Oedipus dies in exile. His sons kill each other. One daughter is buried alive. The other lives in solitude. Thebes, the cursed kingdom, has finally paid its debt to the gods with the total destruction of its royal family. The punishment is over, leaving behind a mournful silence and an eternal lesson in human arrogance in the face of fate. And then, silence fell upon the 7 gates of Thebes. No more cries of battle, no more curses from the king, no more wails from the queen. The palace was cold, the halls of power filled with the echoes of a tragedy that had ended. The line of Laius, begun in sin, elevated in wisdom, and ended in destruction, had finally been wiped from the face of the earth. Thebes was freed from its curse. But this freedom came at the price of a desolate grave. Looking back at the entire tragic sequence of events, from the oracle at Delphi to the cave where Antigone breathed her last, one big question still resonates. Is this a cruel fate, a script written by the gods from which no one can escape? Or is it all the result of human choices? The tragedy of Thebes reveals a more terrifying truth. Both are true. Fate in this story is not a chain that binds people. It is a path that their own flaws lead them down. Laius was not forced to commit a crime. It was his lust and arrogance that cast the curse. Oedipus was not forced to kill at the crossroads. It was his anger and pride that raised the stick. Creon was not forced to condemn Antigone. It was his pride and fear of losing power that blinded him. The gods simply laid out the path, and human nature itself urged them to walk it without knowing it. They fulfilled their destiny not by going against their will, but by being most true to themselves. It is also a tragedy of light and darkness, of seeing eyes and blind souls. Oedipus, the brightest of eyes, fails to see the truth right in front of him. Tiresias, the blind prophet, is the only one who sees the whole picture. Creon, who sees himself as the light of justice and order, is in the darkness of his own stubbornness. Oedipus's act of blinding himself is not just a punishment. It is a bitter admission that these mortal eyes see only illusions of glory and happiness, and that only by extinguishing that false light can one begin to see the truth within. The greatest blindness is not a defect of sight, but the arrogance of believing that one has seen it all. Ultimately, This punished empire leaves behind a warning about truth. Oedipus bravely sought the truth, and it destroyed him. Jocasta tried to deny the truth, and it killed her. Creon imposed his own truth on the kingdom, and it robbed him of everything. Truth, in the world of Thebes, is like the sun, necessary for life, but if you look directly at it for too long, it will burn you blind. Now Thebes is at peace, an empty peace bought with the blood of kings and the tears of princesses. The curse has been washed away, but in the ruins, an eternal lesson still echoes through the ages. That men can build mighty walls, can create laws, can conquer riddles. But they can never conquer the flaws that lie deep within their hearts. And that, in the end, is the most terrible curse of all.